Today is Tuesday, 12th November, and as night follows day, the media this morning are once again telling us who Donald Trump is about to appoint to senior positions in his foreign policy team. And whereas the names that were being widely touted a few days ago were Mike Pompeo and Nikki Haley, today it's Marco Rubio and Waltz. Now, let me say again, I don't know for a fact whether or not Donald Trump is indeed going to appoint Marco Rubio and Waltz, respectively, to the posts of Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. Perhaps he is. We will come to that shortly. But by now, it ought to be obvious that assuming that anything that one reads in mainstream media about appointments is true is, frankly, an assumption that one cannot afford to make. For the record, yesterday I discussed at exhaustive length the fact that the report that appeared in the Washington Post and in Reuters about the telephone conversation between Putin and Trump, which is supposed to have taken place last Thursday. I said that the Russians had denied it. I was prepared to accept their denials. In fact, I unequivocally accepted their denials. Many parts of the media still write and discuss that telephone call, however, as if it happened, ignoring the Russian denial. Over the last couple of hours, Donald Trump has released, or rather his team have released a list of the foreign leaders that Donald Trump has spoken to since he won the election. And surprise, surprise, Vladimir Putin is not one of them. I take that, by the way, as the final definitive, authoritative proof that Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin did not speak with each other, and that the report that appeared in the Washington Post and in Reuters saying that he did is simply wrong, was simply wrong. So let's now discuss the latest reports. Do we have any reason to believe that they are true, whereas all of the other reports have turned out to be untrue? Well, the short answer is that I don't know. I'm going to make a few quick observations, however. Firstly, I read the reports. They do seem to have a little more circumstantial detail about them than other ones, which does incline me to take these latest reports a little more seriously than I took the Pompeo-Haley reports or the other various reports we've seen about possible appointments to Trump's team. That's not to say, by the way, that these reports are true. It's just that this time there does seem to be just that little bit more detail about the reports, which do suggest that whoever is providing this information does indeed have some insight as to what happened, what is happening within Trump's inner team. So we're told that Trump initially was leaning towards Rick Grenell, who was his Director of National Intelligence in the last months of his presidency, and who is strongly loyal to Donald Trump, and that Trump was thinking about appointing Rick Grenell. But then, over the course of one particular day, the ground shifted, certain things happened, some people spoke to him, perhaps people from Florida, which is of course now an important political and electoral base, very important to any Republican who's forming an administration, but no doubt other people as well. And that then decided him to change his mind, and that he accordingly contacted or has already contacted Rubio and Waltz and has offered them their posts. Now, that was one report. Another report said that no final decision had yet been made and admitted that Donald Trump has a habit of changing his mind, and it may be that he's going to change his mind on this one. But anyway, these are somewhat more detailed reports. If Trump does go forward and appoint Rubio and Waltz, what does that tell us? Well, the first thing to say is that as far as I'm concerned, both certainly Rubio and probably Waltz, I know a lot less about Waltz, are straightforward neocons. I don't myself have any significant doubts about this. The difference between Rubio and some of the other neocons is that he is one of the neocons, or one of the hardliners, if you prefer, who is much more focused on China than he is on Russia. In fact, on the conflict in Ukraine, he has said various things at various times over the last year or so, which appear to be closer to the thinking of people on Trump's team than was the case with, say, Pompeo. So, as recently as September, Rubio apparently said that the conflict in Ukraine needed to end in negotiations, that those negotiations needed to acknowledge that Ukraine was not going to recover the territory that it once had and which the Russians have conquered, captured, and which they now occupy. And previously, back in April, when Congress voted the last appropriations package for Ukraine, a package which, by the way, Donald Trump had given the green light to, and which was backed by House Speaker Johnson. Rubio nonetheless went ahead and voted against it. He sided with people like J.D. Vance in the Senate, and he voted against it. And, well, it's not always easy to tell exactly why people take the stance that they do. But my general impression of Marco Rubio is that he is one of those neocons or hardliners who is much more focused on China than he is on Russia. I've discussed in many programs that it is a misconception to think that there is a genuine conflict within the political class, the political establishment in the United States, and I would definitely classify Marco Rubio as somebody who operates within the American political establishment. He is not an outsider in the way that Donald Trump is. Anyway, there's never been, in my opinion, any real division within the the political establishment between people who favor peace as opposed to those who believe in American exceptionalism, a forward policy by the United States who seek confrontation with countries that they see as opposed to the United States, who basically want to refashion the world on the American model, and above all, first and foremost, to preserve American geopolitical primacy. I don't think that there's any member of the political class, the establishment if you prefer, who challenges those orthodoxies, and certainly Marco Rubio is not one of those that does. But there has been a division within the political, military, security establishment, and the deep state, if you like, between those who think that Russia is the primary problem, that the United States must sort out the problem of Russia first and foremost before moving on to the main challenge, which is the challenge presented by China, and those others who take a different view, whose understanding is that China is by far the more powerful adversary than Russia, that Russia can be left to itself, and that the focus should therefore be on China instead. And this second group, which I suspect is dominant amongst many people in the Pentagon especially, also is unhappy about the fact that American arsenals have been depleted, supplying weapons to Ukraine in a way that has made it more difficult for the United States to confront China militarily in the Pacific. So, going for someone like Marco Rubio, and I understand that Waltz in this is rather like Marco Rubio. He too is more what one might call a China hawk than a Russia hawk. Anyway, going for people like Marco Rubio and Waltz could be an indication that Donald Trump has been persuaded that the United States does indeed need to maintain a strong and forceful and even aggressive foreign policy, that he needs a strong, forceful and aggressive Secretary of State rather than one who looks to compromise and to find solutions and to diffuse tensions with American rivals. And that following Trump's visceral instincts, he's opting for, if you like, hardliners, neocons who want to prioritize China over Russia. Now, I'm going to say straight away that if this is the case, if this is why he's going for Rubio and Waltz, and I can't myself see any other reason, then this is certainly a mistake. It resembles very much a brief debate that took place at the start of Joe Biden's administration. I can remember that when Biden took office, an article appeared, a long article appeared in the magazine, the website of the Atlantic Council, which spoke about China as being the great and terrible enemy of the United States, the leader of the coalition of autocracies. It spoke about Xi Jinping, the leader of China, in, shall we say, extremely hostile terms. And it said that the United States should be focused on China. And its argument was that the United States, in order to divide Russia from China, this was the priority, you needed to isolate China, the United States should be prepared to make some concessions to the Russians in Europe to try to draw them away from the Chinese. And what happened over the next few months was consistent with the Biden administration briefly adopting that strategy. Joe Biden, in the first weeks of his administration, took steps to try to calm the situation in Ukraine. Zelensky had deployed a significant number of troops to the contact line in Donbass, and there were reports that he was preparing to launch an offensive against the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. He just passed a decree basically authorizing himself to do that, changing Ukrainian policy to that end. And the Russians responded by mobilizing 100,000 troops to counter this Ukrainian deployment, and there was a brief spike in tensions, and then Biden called Putin, and it was agreed that there would be a degree of de-escalation, and the two presidents then worked together and held a summit meeting a few weeks later in June 2021 in Geneva. And as we know, it was at that meeting that everything fell apart, because Biden came along and tried to get Putin to agree to distance Russia from China. We now have a large amount of circumstantial information that confirms that that was the major objective of the Biden administration at this summit meeting. The person who has discussed all of this most thoroughly and most interestingly is Ray McGovern, former top CIA analyst, a person who once provided the president with his daily brief, and the person who is also a key member, and I believe one of the original founders of Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. As I've said repeatedly, one of the most useful and intelligent and worthwhile institutions that exists in the United States at this time. One whose regular reports ought to be mandatory reading for anybody who wants to understand geopolitics and the direction and the follies of American foreign policy. Anyway, the meeting took place in Geneva. Biden tried to pressure Putin into distancing Russia from China. He made certain offers with respect to Ukraine, but apparently they were of a very minimal nature. They did not in any conceivable shape or form answer Russian concerns about the situation in Ukraine. And Putin, anyway, made it absolutely clear that Russia was not going to break with China, that the relationship with China was fundamental to Russian foreign policy, that there was no conceivable way in which Russia would pick the United States and go against its friend China. And Biden and his team came away from this meeting deeply frustrated and very angry. And, well, a few weeks later, we had that article in National Interest by Wes Mitchell saying that the way to break the Russian-Chinese axis, the strategic partnership between these two countries, was by subjugating Russia to American foreign policy interests. The example chosen being the way in which Bismarck subjugated the Habsburg Empire, Austria-Hungary, to American foreign policy in the late German foreign policy in the late 19th century. And Bismarck managed to do that by inflicting a military defeat on Austria-Hungary in 1866, and the United States should endeavour to do the same thing against Russia, inflict a defeat against Russia, and the place to do it was Ukraine. And from that moment, the whole situation between the United States and Russia began to deteriorate, and it's my belief that that was what launched the countdown to the war in Ukraine, which we now have. Well, what I am hearing, especially from Waltz, perhaps less from Marco Rubio, is something not that different this time. China is the great adversary. Some way must be found to persuade the Russians to break from China. That could involve some concessions to Russia connected to the conflict in Ukraine. The Russians can keep what they have. There need to be negotiations in which the Ukrainians accept that. There's no fundamental rethinking either of the nature of the conflict in Ukraine. There's a tendency to dismiss the Russian position stated by Putin at the foreign ministry meeting in Moscow in June, Putin's demands there as Putin setting out Russia's maximalist position. And the idea is you don't need to accept most of that, or indeed almost any of that. The Russians, however, can hold on to what they have. And, well, we might ease off a bit on the sanctions, or even ease off a lot on the sanctions. But in return, the Russians must agree to end their relationship with China and to align in some way with the United States. And as night follows day, the Russians will reject that. We can say that confidently because over the course of the recent press conference in Sochi, at the Valdai conference, Putin was pointedly asked by a Chinese journalist, if the United States comes along with a deal and offers you an alliance against China, would you agree? And Putin emphatically and straightforwardly said no. He said that he could not imagine that the United States would seriously make a proposal like that. But even if it did, Russia would say no. Its relationship with China is now fundamental and seen as fundamental in Russia's best interests. He even referred to the Chinese over the course of this answer as allies, a fact which he very rarely does, and which the word ally or alliance is one that the Chinese and the Russians tend to avoid. But anyway, Putin made it absolutely clear, crystal clear, that the relationship with China is simply not up for discussion. And after Putin was asked those questions by a Chinese journalist, he received a similar question from a Japanese journalist. A Japanese journalist asked him, why is Russia siding with China? Don't the Russians understand how that is affecting perceptions of Russia in Japan? Why doesn't Russia think beyond its friendship with China? Why doesn't it also understand that there are other countries, important countries in the Far East as well, including Japan? And Putin went out of his way again to say that yes, Russia did seek good relations with Japan. It has no quarrel with Japan. Its military exercises that it undertakes with China are not directed at Japan. The Russians and the Chinese have only started to conduct those exercises in response to the many exercises that the Americans and the Japanese conduct with each other, which have a much longer history than the exercises that the Chinese and the Russians do. And whilst Russia has very positive views of Japan, he mentioned how the Russians have great admiration, how there's great admiration in Russia for Japanese culture and Japanese cuisine and all of those things, all of which is true, by the way. He went on to say that, again, the relationship with China is not up for negotiation. It is not something that the Russians are prepared to bargain with, and certainly not to bargain away. So I think this point needs to be understood again in Washington. If Rubio and Waltz have told Trump that he can make a few concessions to the Russians on peripheral issues, and that will somehow cause the Russians to change their policy and to distance themselves from China, that is going to be that is a setup for disappointment. And if the proposals that are going to be made bear any resemblance to the two plans that have been floated in the media, Neocon Plan Light and Neocon Plan Heavy, the freeze being the one, the sort of capitulation plan being the other. Well, again, the Russians have made it crystal clear that they're going to say no. So if Trump and Rubio and Waltz really do think that they can persuade the Russians to change course in that way, then they're making exactly the same mistake that the Biden administration made in 2022. And, well, that might lead, in fact, just as it did with the Biden administration, to a completely unwanted, and I do generally believe on this time, it is generally unwanted, further deterioration in relations between the United States and Russia. In 2021, I think there was a genuine argument, a genuine debate within the Biden administration between anti-Russia hawks and anti-China hawks, which the anti-Russia hawks emphatically won. I think this time round, it's not quite the same, but the outcome could end up being the same, even if there is no real desire to enter into some kind of long, unlimited conflict with Russia. I say all of that. I ought to say that I was struck and frankly depressed by some of the comments that have apparently been made by Waltz, and which he made fairly recently. Firstly, he again trotted out the old fantasy, the old myth that Russia is nothing more than a gas station masquerading as a country, that its entire economic strength depends entirely on its ability to export oil and gas. He said that the United States could pressure Putin into negotiations by imposing restrictions on exports by Russia of oil and gas, that the United States could push the Russians out of world energy markets by lifting export restrictions on US oil and gas. All that will do, that is a formula for simply raising energy prices. Energy prices in the United States as well. It is again exactly what the current administration has tried to do. They also appear to have believed that Russia is a gas station masquerading as a country. I can remember that at the time when the sanctions were being discussed early on, before the special military operation had even begun, an anonymous senior administration official had a long discussion with the media in Washington in which he referred to Russia as a one-dimensional economy dependent on just energy sales. It's dismaying that 3 years after the start of the war, when we have seen in the most clear-cut way how utterly wrong that was, someone like Waltz, who supposedly is being considered for the post of National Security Advisor, genuinely believes that. So restrictions on Russian oil and gas exports have been attempted many times. The Europeans tried to stop importing Russian oil and gas. They're now having to import a lot more of it because they can't get by without it. But anyway, they did try for a time to end their imports of Russian oil and gas. They're importing oil and gas either in the form of liquefied natural gas from Russia or through circuitous routes using India in effect as a middleman. Just saying. So that didn't work. And then Waltz also said that the United States could also put further pressure on the Russians by authorizing missile strikes deep into Russia, exactly what the Russians have said they would respond to very strongly, because it would cross a red line and would be treated by them as an act of war. One senses again that Waltz in particular imagines that in dealing with the Russians, he is playing with a much stronger hand than the one he actually does. Again, if this is his real thinking, if this is the approach he's going to take or will advocate in the event that he is appointed Donald Trump's national security advisor, it's all going to end in a smash. The Russians will continue not just doing exactly what they're doing, but probably escalating, as they have said they would. And we're going to get another renewed surge of inflation on the back of the much higher energy prices that these policies are inevitably going to cause. But there's something else, because of course this approach is going to do something further. It's going to, first of all, make the Chinese even more anxious to preserve their relationship with Russia. If they see Pompeo and Waltz coming over the horizon, talking about the need to confront China, to face down China, to defeat China in some kind of strategic global competition, then of course the Chinese are going to be looking for allies, and of course their most important ally is the Russians. The Chinese journalist who asked that question to Putin, would China consider changing alliances, returning or switching to an alliance with the United States against China? The very fact that that kind of question is asked at all, and asked by a Chinese journalist, shows just how nervous the Chinese are about where Russia might decide to go. So, given that this is the case, if the Americans come after the Chinese in that kind of way, if Pompeo and Waltz step up support for Taiwan, try to put further pressure on China in the way that they've been talking about, Rubio and Waltz start doing all of these things, well then the Chinese are going to turn to the Russians and say, can you please hurry up and finish the Power of Siberia pipeline? We're going to need your gas and your oil even more. Let's move forward even faster with the alternative finance and debt and credit systems and messaging systems that we talked about in Kazan, because the Americans are now clearly working and moving to put us under siege. And if Rubio and Waltz believe that they can also pressure the Russians to break from China by escalating, by putting more restrictions on Russian energy exports, and by launching deep missile strikes against Russia, then of course the Russians will also reciprocate by turning to the Chinese. This policy, if this is going to be the policy, if Rubio and Waltz really are appointed to the positions that speculation is saying, if they really are appointed to these positions, and if they really do follow through with the sort of policies that they have spoken about, then what they're going to end up doing is exactly what the Biden administration ended up doing. Instead of causing a rift between China and Russia, it brought them even more closely and further together. And that is what, as I said, this Rubio-Waltz strategy, if that is their strategy, everybody obviously has the ability to change their minds. But if that is their strategy, that is where it is going to end up with. Now, you can already see the first signs of how the Russians and the Chinese might respond to these sort of moves. Because Sergei Shoigu, Secretary of Russia's Security Council, Putin's national security advisor, has been again on his travels. And this time he has been to Beijing. He's met there with Wang Yi. They had a lengthy discussion with each other. And it's quite obvious, to me at least, that the reason that Shoigu went to Beijing is because he needed, the Russians wanted to make sure, reassure the Chinese that the friendship between China and Russia is indeed not up for negotiation, and that the two countries will remain not just close, but closer still. TASS has an interesting report about Shoigu's visit, and it quotes Wang Yi as saying the following: "We are ready to communicate with the Russian side, closely interact and coordinate actions in response to changes in the international environment." Changes in the international environment obviously is a gentle way of referring to the election of Donald Trump. Beijing will enhance cooperation with Moscow in a multilateral format to ensure global stability. China intends to maintain high-level progress in relations with Russia and ensure global strategic stability together, Wang Yi emphasized. So there we are. The Chinese and the Russians already exchanging and comparing notes based on what they're hearing coming out of Washington. And of course, these latest reports that Rubio and Waltz are being considered for senior positions in the administration are already having an effect, making them coordinate even further. Now, the issue of the appointment of Rubio and Waltz also, I suspect, is of interest to another capital, and that is Tehran, because though Rubio and Waltz have a reputation as being strong China hawks, they also have an equally clear-cut reputation of being strong pro-Israel and anti-Iran hawks. And the new UN ambassador that Donald Trump has appointed, Congressman Stefanik, I understand that she too has a background as being a strong critic of Iran and a strong supporter of Israel. And again, it's unsurprising that the Iranians, for their part, are also responding to these events and have been very busy over the last few days, indicating what they might be minded to do. So the first thing to say is that over the last 24 hours, Iran and Saudi Arabia have conducted high-level military talks. The top Saudi and Iranian military chiefs have just had a meeting in Tehran, and we have a report about this from the Tasnim news agency, which is of course Iranian, and it reports the following: the highest-ranking military commanders of Iran and Saudi Arabia weighed plans for closer cooperation between the two countries at a meeting in Tehran. Heading a high-profile delegation, Chief of the General Staff of the Saudi Armed Forces, Lieutenant General Fayyad bin Hamad al-Ruwaili, arrived in Iran on Sunday. The top is Saudi commander held talks with Chief of Staff of the Iranian Armed Forces, Major General Mohammad Hossein Bakeri, in Tehran. The two generals discussed a range of issues, including the expansion of defense diplomacy and promotion of cooperation between the two Muslim countries. Now, Saudi Arabia has been hosting a major conference of the Islamic states in Riyadh. The conference was critical of the Israeli attack on Iran. Iran participated in that conference, and according to the Iranian reports, they're very happy with the way that conference went. And the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, has also made clear that there will be no movement, as far as he's concerned, on any diplomatic recognition as between Saudi Arabia and Israel, unless and until there is a full and complete ceasefire in Gaza and in Lebanon. That remains the Saudi position. So anyway, these are steps that the Iranians are going to be happy about. The Iranians have also been in detailed discussions with Iraq about Iraq closing its airspace to Israeli aircraft and missiles, which might be launched against Iran in the event of a further follow-up attack by Israel against Iran. So one can see that the Iranians are taking steps to shore up their military positions. But the Iranians have also been saying a lot of other things. And let's start first of all with the Iranian Foreign Minister, Abbas Araghchi. He has now categorically and in the strongest terms denied Iran's involvement in any assassination attempt against Donald Trump. As you may all remember, a couple of days ago I did a program about the reports that Iran had sent an assassin to try to murder Donald Trump. I expressed my incredulity and disbelief that Iran would, especially at this time, seek to do anything of that sort. There's been, by the way, virtually nothing more said about this supposed assassination attempt over the last couple of days. But anyway, Araghchi has now gone out of his way to strongly deny that such an attempted assassination attempt by Iran has ever taken place. And these are the words: remember the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran right after our president's inauguration. Everybody knows who did it and why. Now, with another election, a new scenario is fabricated with the same goal. As a killer does not exist in reality, script writers are brought in to manufacture a third-rate comedy. Who can in their right mind believe that a supposed assassin sits in Iran and talks online to the FBI? Here is a dose of reality worthy of consideration. The American people have made their decision, and Iran respects their right to elect the president of their choice. The path forward is also a choice. It begins with respect. And then he went on to say, and this is... He now addressed the question of Iran's plans or potential plans to acquire nuclear weapons. Iran is not after nuclear weapons, period. That is a policy based on Islamic teachings and our security calculations. Confidence building is needed from both sides. It is not a one-way street. So, Araghchi says, what we're actually saying is this: we have never attempted to assassinate Donald Trump. This whole story is absurd and is a fabrication. It's a comedy, as he puts it. The purpose clearly is to cause trouble between the United States and Iran, between Donald Trump and Iran, and that is not our plan. Nor do we have any plan or desire to acquire nuclear weapons. Our teachings, Islamic teachings, in other words, Khamenei's fatwa, and our security calculations dictate otherwise. We respect Donald Trump's election. That is a matter for the American people. But Donald Trump, his administration, has a choice. If he chooses accommodation with us, then what is needed are confidence-building measures. But if he does not, then it is not a one-way street. We're not going to make compromises to the Americans if they are hostile to us, and that our relations will then deteriorate, and then by necessary extension, our security calculations will change. And going back to the Islamic teachings, that is, of course, Ayatollah Khamenei's province, as Dr. Kharazi, the former Iranian foreign minister, for whom Abbas Araghchi once worked, well, as Dr. Kharazi pointed out in that very long and detailed interview he gave to Al Mayadeen, which I discussed a couple of days ago. So the Iranians categorically denying the whole report that there was any kind of assassination attempt by the Iranians against Donald Trump. They're saying it is absurd. And that, I have to say, is exactly what it looks to me. I have to say this, I do wonder whether this story about the assassination attempt on Donald Trump by Iran hasn't been in part fabricated or manipulated in order not just to push Trump and the United States into a confrontation with Iran, but also to anger Donald Trump in a way that would persuade him to appoint anti-Iran hardliners like first Pompeo and Haley, and in place of those, Rubio and Waltz. Nothing would surprise me, and that sort of thing, by the way, I'm afraid in the world of Washington politics would be completely unsurprising. So anyway, the Iranians taking a strong line, saying that this is absolutely not what they want and not what they intend to do. In the meantime, as I said, the Iranians are busy mending their fences, building up their relations with their friends, their neighbors, the Saudis, their new friends and neighbors, the Saudis, and the Iraqis. And of course, they're also moving forward with their financial plans. They have now completed an agreement with the Russians to create linkages between Iran's admittedly very unstable and chaotic financial system and Russia's. And again, this is from the Tasnim news agency, that there are also similar reports, almost identical reports about this in Russian news agencies. Iran and Russia's payment systems were formally interconnected on Monday, allowing travelers from the two nations to use their domestic debit cards for purchases in each country. In a formal ceremony in Tehran on Monday, attended by the governor of the Bank of Iran and managers of Iranian banks, a previous agreement on the connection of Iran's Shetab and Russia's Mercouris payment systems for electronic fund transfers took effect. In the first phase, Iranian nationals are able to use their Shetab cards under the Karoba smart debit card scheme to withdraw rubles from ATMs across Russia. During the second stage, which will take place, by the way, at the end of this year, Russian travellers will be able to use their Mir cards in Iran. After the implementation of stage 3, which will be in the first half of 2025, Iranian nationals will be allowed to use their Shetab cards in the point-of-sale terminals of all shops across Russia. And by the way, as I understand it, Russian travellers to Iran will be able to use their Mir cards in the same way. So obviously this is just the first step in interconnecting messaging and payment systems. Before long, the Russians are going to be doing the same thing with Union Pay in China, and they have already advanced very far, apparently, in doing that in Cuba. In a few months' time, probably next year, it will be possible for Russian travellers to use Mir cards in Cuba as well. These, as I said, are basically, the simpler steps taken by the BRIC states in developing their payment and transfer and messaging systems. But all of that is going to develop much more quickly from this point, and the first step is often the most difficult one in even the longest journey. So again, the Iranians moving forward with their interconnections, with their relationship with the Russians, and if there is a major attempt to pressure the Iranians over the next year or so by the Trump administration, then just as pressuring the Chinese and the Russians will simply draw those two countries closer together, so pressuring the Iranians and the Russians is going to do exactly the same. This policy of confrontation with all of these countries that some people in Washington are addicted to, the one thing it is guaranteed to achieve is the opposite of what those people intend. Now, in fairness, it should be said that even as we wait to see whether Rubio and Waltz are appointed to their respective positions, whether these reports that are appearing in the media are true, and even as we wait to see what, if they are appointed, Rubio and Waltz will actually do, we still are getting strong indications that the Trump administration, or the future Trump administration, is actually moving in a completely different direction, that it is still intent on trying to mend fences with the Russians, and that this is the new president's priority. In fact, I've seen a report that Trump himself is going to divide up foreign policy issues. He's going to focus on the Middle East himself. He's going to delegate the issue of handling Ukraine to the Vice President, J.D. Vance, who is extremely well informed about all aspects of the Ukrainian crisis. I have been impressed by how well informed he is, by the way. And presumably Pompeo and Waltz would, if they are appointed, be focused on China instead. But anyway, we've had a number of comments by various officials, individuals connected to Trump, and they do still seem to expect a significant change of direction. So Steve Bannon, who was Trump's chief strategist, and with whom Trump still apparently maintains a friendly relationship, has just given an interview to the Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera. And he says things like this: "It's clear that Trump wants to end this semi-obsession with pushing NATO almost into Russian territory. Trump's MAGA movement seeks to completely cut funding to Ukraine. Europe, including Italy, will ultimately follow Trump's lead. And if they truly believe what they have been saying in recent years, they should be ready to pay." Bannon went on to say that he does not plan to rejoin the administration. He says that he does expect Robert Kennedy Jr., Elon Musk, and Tucker Carlson to be active members of Trump's transition team, and that the career of Mike Pompeo is over. So that was what Bannon said. He seems to be thinking that Trump continues to want to basically leave Ukraine alone leave it to its own devices. Let Vance, JD Vance, deal with it, but basically dump it into the hands of the Europeans. And Elon Musk, who has played a significant role in Trump's election, anyway, he has also made it clear that his opinions about the Ukraine war has not changed. He's said this on his page, his X page, that the conflict seems like a forever war with no progress, in which Ukraine is simply sacrificing its youth for no territorial gain. And that he hopes, he's also said this, that he hopes that the bloodshed in Ukraine is going to end soon. So that is from Elon Musk. And to repeat again, these views, the views that Bannon has expressed and Elon Musk has expressed, which have been echoed by others, including, by the way, Marco Rubio, it must be said, that this war in Ukraine has really proved a complete fiasco, a total debacle. To my mind, it closely mirrors the feeling, as I've said, amongst Trump's electorate. And Trump himself should be extremely careful not to disappoint that electorate by going against it and getting drawn further into the conflict in Ukraine. And I hope that he remembers this and that he follows what I strongly suspect are his visceral feelings on this issue. He's got no reason to like Zelensky, who played a certain role in his first impeachment. He's got no reason to like all of those advocates of unending conflict in Ukraine. He's got no reason to like the Europeans who advocate that conflict in Ukraine, the continuation of that conflict in Ukraine also. And as Alex Christoforou and I discussed in a program we did on the Duran, he needs to understand that those who are trying, some of those who are trying to draw him into the conflict in Ukraine are basically laying a trap. Well, that's all I'm going to say about the United States. We see the Russians and the Chinese making their preparations, the Iranians also. And we see we have this swirl of uncertainty about what's going to happen in the United States. It ought to be said that with every passing day, if Donald Trump does want to change policy over Ukraine and other things, his position is becoming stronger. Not only has he won a clear, decisive victory in terms of the Electoral College, but it's now definitely confirmed that he's going to win the popular vote by a significant margin. The Senate has a strong Republican majority, and as I'm making this program, it looks as if the Republicans are going to retain control of the House of Representatives, where Speaker Johnson, incidentally, is again saying that there is no support amongst Republicans in the House for further funding for Ukraine. Trump himself has been urging the Senate not to delay the appointment of the people he selects for senior positions in his administration. I think he's right to say that, by the way. I still remember the way in which the Democrats and some Republican senators made it all but impossible for Trump to fill positions in his administration in his first term. He needs to get a strong team together as quickly as possible and to get everybody in their jobs and moving forward with the least possible delay. I've already explained in many programs how difficult the international situation currently is. That's the first thing. But putting all that aside, with both houses in Congress likely to be under Republican control, and with the Republican Party in Congress clearly owing its victory to him, he is clearly in the ascendant, and I think he should make the most of it whilst he can. If he delays, if he gives his opponents time and space to reorganize, they will of course do so, and amongst those opponents there continue to be people within the Republican Party as well. So anyway, that's what I wanted to say about Donald Trump. Now, of course, Trump may be heading towards trying to close the conflict in Ukraine, but all the mood and talk in Europe is otherwise. Now, in Germany, after a lot of argument and quarrelling, a decision has been made to hold early elections in February. Everyone, I think, can see that the current government of Olaf Scholz has run out of road. There was a long article by Andrew Statterford in The Economist which spoke about the very, very bad situation in Germany. It talked about Angela Merkel as being largely responsible for many of these problems, about the long period of stagnation and complacency over which she presided. I find it fascinating to read these things about Angela Merkel, or these criticisms of Angela Merkel that people are making today. As anybody who's been following the Duran, and indeed my writings from going back even before the Duran was founded, I was talking about the immobilism and stagnation and complacency of the Merkel era, well back into the late 2000s, before even the 2010s began. Now, where I was at that time an outlier, I noticed that I've suddenly become, that view has suddenly become mainstream. But anyway, put all that aside. I'm not going to talk about the problems in Germany now. The thing I'm going to say is this: Statterford makes the absolutely valid point that the current government in Germany, which has failed, is going to be replaced by a new government, which is also going to fail, because Friedrich Merz is offering no significant new ideas. He may think he is, but he's offering no significant new ideas that look likely to change the situation in Germany anytime soon. In fact, he seems to be determined to do more of the same in terms of Germany's biggest single problem, which is the collapse of its relationships with Russia and China. He's now again threatening Russia with missile strikes. It's extraordinary how this idea of missile strikes, terrible idea as it is, just never seems to go away. Anyway, he's again threatening the Russians with missile strikes. He's also talking about an accelerated steps to bring Ukraine into NATO, something which I suspect will be bitterly unpopular with much of the German public, and which might even lose him votes in the election if he's not careful. But anyway, he's talking about all of these things. He is sounding to me, and I have to say this, a little bit like Konrad Adenauer did back in, say, 1960. It's the same sort of language. It's a throwback to the language and ideas of that time in a situation, a global situation, and a situation in Germany which has profoundly and completely changed. What Germany needs is to bring about stability in Europe, to return things to a condition of peace so that it can go about sorting out its many intractable problems, which without peace in Europe, are simply going to get worse. But that's apparently what the next Chancellor of Germany wants to do. He wants to go back to the world of 1960. Joe Biden, when he became president, wanted to return everything to how it was in 1990. Merz wants to go back further still. He wants to go back to 1960, to the time before Ostpolitik and all of that was started by Germany, even though the Ostpolitik policies followed by German governments from the 1960s proved spectacularly successful and were instrumental in providing Germany with that prosperity which has now been lost. But anyway, that's what Merz wants to do. Everywhere else, it's no better. Macron and Starmer had their meeting. They didn't come up with anything new. The head of the Royal Air Force in Britain is also now advocating missile strikes on Russia. Why anybody thinks, by the way, that that's going to make any difference in the course of the war, I simply cannot understand. And the European Union is going to change its rules so as to allow money from the structural funds. These are the funds that the EU spends or provides to the member states, which are intended to help the member states to upgrade their infrastructure. Anyway, the EU is now going to allow funding, money from the structural funds, to be used in defence or defence-related expenditure. Now that, by the way, means two things. Firstly, it means that the bulk of the money from the structural funds is going to go to Germany, because that is where the biggest arms factories in Europe, arms companies in Europe are located, and where the argument can be made, the priority needs to be given from a military perspective in improving road and transport links. It also means that countries in southern Europe, where the structural funds have provided a significant material incentive to some people, you might even call it a bribe, to support the EU, because EU funding through the structural funds enables them to build roads and bridges and all kinds of things, some of which have little inherent value, by the way, but which does allow money to reach some people in these countries, providing, as I said, a strong and very vocal constituency of support for the EU. Anyway, all of these people looking at the redirection of EU funding in that way are likely to be, over time, very annoyed, and who knows, in time their loyalty to the EU might actually start to waver. But anyway, that's what the EU wants to do, because again, it is obsessed with Ukraine and Russia. Actually, it's really obsessed with Russia, and it wants to continue exactly in the same way that it has previously done. And, well, Medvedev, deputy chair of the Russian Security Council, he has talked about all of this, and you can see in the comments that he's made on his Telegram channel. In this, I no doubt, he reflects the scorn and contempt that the Russians have with the European leaders of today. Frankly, it is simply astonishing to what extent the current generation of European politicians seeks to extend their war to their own territories, to the delight of the Americans, by the way, and against the will of their own people. All the lessons of World War II have faded. Experienced and not just simply intelligent European leaders have disappeared into history. What has come to power are nobodies with inflated egos. And Medvedev goes on to say that the worst scenario appears to be the most likely one, that European leaders are experiencing autumn blues after Trump's election victory. First, there is a Frenchman, he's referring to Macron, who advocates supporting Kiev in the event of American withdrawal, when there are NATO chiefs trying to come up with smart ideas on how to actively engage in war with us for the long time. And now the candidate for the German chancellorship, Merz, has issued an ultimatum to us. Either end the special military operation, or we provide the Ukrainians with Taurus missiles. The goal is to bring the conflict with Russia to an irreversible stage. And Medvedev goes on to say that such actions can only prolong the agony of the Kiev regime, but will not change the course of the special military operation. And he's absolutely right on every count. The quality of European leadership, apart from a few notable exceptions, Orban in Hungary, Fico in Slovakia, perhaps just possibly eventually Meloni in Italy. The quality of European leadership at the moment is abysmal. And it's fascinating to see how their first reaction to Donald Trump is not to rethink their strategies, but to double and triple and quadruple down on all the things that they've tried to do and which have so completely failed over the last 3 years, when the Americans have been all on board and fully supportive with them. And what do they expect that all of this is going to do? Now, I received a report yesterday that one of the reasons that the Russians are able to advance so fast now in southwestern Donbass is that there is a critical shortage of landmines, that Ukraine isn't able to lay landmines to the extent that it could earlier in the war. And the reason for that is because there is a critical shortage of TNT, and the reason that explosives, and the reason that there is a shortage of explosives is because a disproportionate amount of explosives are now having to be used to try to increase artillery shell production, which of course itself is also running far behind schedule. It's bizarre to see all of this, and still the Europeans talking about keeping going without the United States. Well, in the meantime, the situation on the front lines goes for Ukraine from bad to worse. Now, I discussed how, I think it was in a program or so ago, about how the Ukrainians have been making all sorts of claims to have carried out successful counterattacks in all sorts of places, in Kursk region, in Chasiv Yar, in Toretsk. I expressed my deep skepticism about this. We've now got quite a lot of further information about the situation in all of these places, and I am frankly becoming deeply skeptical about whether these alleged counterattacks actually ever took place. Over the course of the last 24 hours, we've had a lot of film and photographic evidence from the Kursk area. And what it has overwhelmingly done, or so it seems to me, is confirmed Russian advances. It looks as if the Russians are almost fully in control of the important village of Darino, which is one of the villages that they attacked, that the village of Pogrevki is definitely under Russian control, that the Russians are continuing to advance in all sorts of places, and Group of Forces North this morning said that they had advanced by a further 4.5 kilometers. Again, that doesn't explain exactly where that advance is, but it looks as if that the Russians are advancing in the Kursk pocket from every side, from the west, from the southeast, in the area of the village of Plekhovo, which they have now or so it seems to me, largely surrounded, and from the north, where they've captured Pogrevki and are pushing south towards Suja. By the way, and for the record, there has been no visible sign so far of North Korean troops. All the talk about North Korean troops that we've been hearing so much about so far, the Ukrainians claim to have fought them. They provide no evidence of this, and there is no visible sign of North Korean troops fighting alongside the Russians anywhere in the Kursk pocket. There continue to be lots of stories and reports and rumours and claims that the Russians have built up a force of 50,000 men to clear the Kursk pocket. That might even be true. I also, however, have to say that the pile-up of elite Ukrainian brigades in the Kursk pocket now is astonishing. They're all there. The Naval Infantry Brigades, the Airborne Brigades, the 47th Mechanized Brigade, all of them are fighting in this small territory of woods and rivers and little streams and tiny villages and hamlets. To achieve what? They're fighting there. They're gradually losing ground. The Russians are pushing forward. The Ukrainians are taking more and more losses. But apparently the political imperative for Zelensky of defending the Kursk pocket is so strong that he's piled in all his best military units. His overall military commander, General Syrski, has made it, I think, fairly clear that he wants to see the Kursk pocket extinguished and the Ukrainian troops there pulled out and redeployed to more useful places. But Zelensky refuses to do that. Zelensky, by the way, at the recent summit meeting in Budapest, according to the Financial Times, again ruled out any territorial concessions to the Russians at all. He continues to insist that the only acceptable proposal is his peace plan. In other words, for a complete withdrawal of all Russian troops from Ukraine. He's hit on this mantra that this is the only just outcome consistent with international law. And he seems to think that this is the conclusive winning point in the argument. It has a degree of unreality about it, which I have to say I find astonishing and difficult to understand. But anyway, that's Zelensky, and as I said, even as he indulges in his fantasies about the outcome of the war, he continues to pile in his troops in Kursk region. Everywhere else, he continues, the Ukrainians are on the defensive, and increasingly so. So yesterday I discussed that there were reports that the Russians have broken into Kupiansk and that there is now fighting going on in that town. It seems that that is true, though there's been no reports, further reports, discussing what exactly is going on in Kursk since that initial report that the Russians have indeed broken through into Kursk region. Elsewhere, the Ukrainians claimed that they'd been successful in pushing the Russians back in Chasiv Yar. On the contrary, it appears that it's the Russians who've captured an important village in the southwestern outskirts of Chasiv Yar. And there's some talk now that the Ukrainian troops in Chasiv Yar are close to operational encirclement. But none of this comes close to capturing the level of the disaster, and disaster is the right word, that is happening to the Ukrainian forces in southwestern Donbass. First of all, for reasons that are difficult to understand, it looks as if the Ukrainians themselves destroyed a dam in the Kurakhovo reservoir, flooding some territory in a way that apparently they supposed would slow the advance of the Russian army. Now, I say that it was the Ukrainians who did this. There are some people who question this, but it does seem that the balance of the evidence suggests that it was indeed the Ukrainians rather than the Russians. If it was the Ukrainians, then, as any number of commentators are pointing out, what the Ukrainians have done is, yes, they've flooded some territory, which could slow the Russians a little, but they've made retreat for the Ukrainian garrison in Kurakhovo itself much more difficult by flooding some of the major retreat lines. There is even some speculation that what actually happened was that the Ukrainians themselves underestimated the effect of the destruction of this dam. Anyway, we've had more news in the Kurakhovo area. The Russians have now captured the village of Novoselidivka. This is a village north of the Kurakhovo reservoir. The Russians entered it some time ago. I don't think that is particularly important news, but they have definitely, apparently, also captured the villages of Novodimitrivka and Voznesenka. They are close to encircling and will probably capture before long the village of Zoria, and they have captured now perhaps the greater part of the fortified village of Sontsivka, which we were led to think was the place which the Ukrainians would be able to stop the Russians. But the biggest disaster is happening south of Kurakhovo, the south of the Kurakhovo reservoir, where the Russians have now reached and are in the process of capturing the village of Danye, which lies directly south of Kurakhovo, even as they continue to advance within Kurakhovo itself. And if Danye comes under full Russian control, which of course it will, then the entire Ukrainian defense line to the south, the one that goes along the villages of Yelizavetivka and Ilinka and all of those places, and Uspenivka and Suhi Yali, well, of course, that defense line will collapse. In fact, the Ukrainian troops who are still defending these villages will have to retreat fast if they're not going to find themselves completely trapped. But the point is that if Donetsk falls under Russian control, then, especially now that the dam has been destroyed and that the exit routes have been flooded, the garrison in Kurakhovo could very easily find itself trapped as well. There are, in fact, reports early this morning that the Ukrainian command, Syrskyi presumably, have finally acknowledged the inevitable and are beginning a pullout of Ukrainian troops from Kurakhovo and from the areas to the south of Kurakhovo, which I presume refers to those villages, Yelizavetivka, Ilinka, and all of Uspenivka and all of the others. So it could be that within the next couple of days, we're going to see this entire front line collapse, completely collapse, with the Russians in control of a huge belt of territory all the way south from Ugleda, all the way north to the outskirts of Pokrovsk itself, with Pokrovsk likely to come under attack at some point within the next few weeks. Well, that's the area around Kurakhovo. There are more and more reports also. The General Teplinsky and group of forces Dnieper are starting some kind of major offensive in Zaporozhye region. The initial target being the village, the small town of Gulyapolye, which lies east of Orekhov. Maybe Orekhov as well. We'll see. But in the meantime, reports that were appearing yesterday about Russian advances in the Velika Novosilka area have been partially confirmed and partially refuted. Refuted in the sense that it seems that the claims that the Russians had swept into Velika Novosilka and had taken control of the entire village, which I was skeptical about, that those reports are definitely premature. But there is no doubt now that the Russians either control all or nearly all of the village of Mercouris, south of Velika Novosilka, and that they are also steadily pushing not just northward, but westwards as well. There is a report that, as well as Mercouris, the Russians have captured another village called Rivnopil, which is somewhere to the west, not far from the main roads leading from Velika Novosilka westwards to Kurakhovo. Well, if that is true, then Velika Novosilka is largely surrounded. The Russians control Zolotaya Niva, Shakhtarskaya and Yasnaya Polyana to the east and north of Velika Novosilka and control the major roads. They would control Mercouris and Urozhaine immediately to the south, and with Rivnopol also soon under Russian control, or perhaps already under Russian control, the Russians would be able to cut off the road to Velika Novosilka and encircle it from the west. And by the way, with the Russians also in Yasnaya Polyana and Shakhtarskaya, they're probably in a strong position to cut the roads to Velika Novosilka from the north as well. It looks as if the small but important and well-fortified town is some days or weeks away from being completely surrounded. And I would make a guess that if Velika Novosilka falls, then Gulyapolye and Kurakhovo are captured, and that could be the objective of General Teplinsky's forces, then the way is open to the Dnieper and to Zaporozhye itself. Well, anyway, we see that the disaster on the Ukrainian battle lines continues and accelerates. The Russians advancing now almost without meeting effective resistance. And in Washington, we still have this game of musical chairs with the appointments. No doubt by the time this program is published, we will know whether Rubio and Waltz really have been appointed to these senior positions. But one way or the other, to repeat again and to remind ourselves that this is what Medvedev has already said, the outcome of the war in Ukraine has already been settled. And if Trump and the people around him have failed to understand that yet and believe that they have more cards to play than they really do, then they are at risk of severe and acute disappointment. Well, that's me for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Don't forget that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribe Star, links under this video. Don't forget also to check out our shop. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.